Good morning, and thank you so much for taking the time to be here with me today. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Alyssa, and I am a journalism major and a visual media emphasis here at Biola. Before we begin, just a little about me. I was born in Hawaii, raised there my whole life, and God made it pretty clear to me that I needed to be here at Biola. And so I bought a plane ticket and declared my major as English, which might come as a surprise to some of you. And don't worry, it only lasted a couple of weeks because I realized journalism is where I needed to be. And fast forward a few years, here we are at the summit. Now, it's not a mistake that I bring up my brief time as an English major. Actually, it played a large part in the presentation that is right before you. So I started thinking, why was I English to begin with, and why did I switch to journalism? There had to have been some common denominator that compelled me. So I did what I was taught to do in elementary school, and I drew a Venn diagram. The list didn't get very far, though, because I found out that there's words, grammar, things that they have in common. But the big one I found out pretty quickly was storytelling. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. See, I've always been fascinated by the idea of stories. In high school, I read through the Hunger Games series in 4 days, and to this day will choose to binge watch Stranger Things instead of do homework. And in that decision, choosing Netflix over homework every time, I realized that stories demand our attention. There's something about stories that grip us. Not only that, stories are everywhere. So I mentioned Netflix. Another big one is Instagram stories, something that we check constantly. And then lastly, commercials. I didn't realize this, but I think it tells a lot about how prevalent storytelling is in our society in our day and age if we look at advertising. And so I could explain to you how storytelling is seen in the advertising world, but as a visual emphasis, I think it'd be better to show you. Let's take a look. Great. So I actually remembered this commercial as I was making this presentation. I saw it for the first time a couple of years back when it came out. And it was memorable to me because it actually brought me to tears. I remember texting my best friend with tears streaming down my face and telling her that I had cried at a gum commercial. And so that really got me thinking, there has to be something to this idea of stories. There's some power or something that compels us. And so that's what I kind of want to focus on for a second, is the power of stories. Now, to be fair, my presentation isn't to convince you that stories are powerful. Today, I'd actually rather explain why I think that is. But before we get into that, we're just going to camp out here for a second, and I want to share one more concrete example of an impactful story. So raise your hand, or if any of you have heard the name Ilan Kurdi. Okay. Maybe, and if not, then maybe this next picture will ring a bell. And if not this one, then maybe the next. See, these images were viral and made headlines globally and internationally in August of 2015. I'm not sure if you remember it. Headlines like, 3-year-old Syrian boy washed up on the shores of Turkey. Humanity washed ashore. And see, there are people behind these stories and faces behind these headlines. So Abdullah, on the left, Abdullah Kurdi, is the father of these two boys, Ilan and Galip, 3 and 5 years old. They, along with their mother, made a trip fleeing Syria on a 5-meter-long dinghy headed for Kos in Greece when their boat capsized. The boys and their mother drowned, and the next morning, the two boys were found on the shores of Turkey. By that afternoon, their photos had gone viral internationally and made headlines, again, in dozens of newspapers. And so I bring this up because Ilan, for some reason, put a face to the refugee crisis, put a face to this idea that had been around, but no one actually understood or cared about, at least to the extent that they did after. And so to give you some examples of how he not only put a face to this crisis, but made change, we're going to look at statistics from Migrant Offshore Aid Station. Okay, so this is a nonprofit that sends boats to rescue refugees at sea. The week before Aylan's photo was circulated, they were averaging about $10,000 in donations a week. The week immediately following the photos, suddenly there were $1.1 million being donated. So what about a story can bring me to tears, even if it's about gum? And what about a story can compel people to action, compel people to give and have compassion? And that's what I want to talk to you about today. So the premise of everything that I'm about to share with you is the following. It's that we as human beings are deeply relational and we're meaning-seeking. And what I'd suggest to you today is that storytelling is impactful because it meets us here at the core of who we are. Okay, so let's talk about art. Storytelling as an art. But before we jump into that, I'd like you to hear about art from someone who actually knows something about art. And so I had the opportunity to interview a friend of mine. Her name is Alyssa Llanos. She's an art major here at Biola, and I'd love for you to hear what she has to say.
My name is Alyssa Llanos. I'm an art major. I've been doing art most of my life. My dad's an art teacher. My grandmother is also an artist. My great-grandmother is also an artist. So it's been a big part of my life, my entire childhood. I think what makes art so powerful to the individual is just the fact that it's an extension of themselves and making something that reflects themselves. So whatever they choose as their subject is what they find value and beauty in. So it's kind of cool as a viewer to see what people hold important to themselves. And like a story, it's kind of timeless, and you can keep revisiting it and reinterpreting it and reimagining the connections that it has. Art is engaging, it's powerful, it's vulnerable, it's introspective.
All right. So I love the way that she talked about things from a very personal perspective because she is an artist. So the words that she used at the end are powerful, vulnerable, engaging, introspective. And we're going to take a look at this definition of art and re-envision it and rework it to fit storytelling, and also in light of what Addie shared with us. So art is something that is created with imagination and skill, or that is beautiful, or expresses important ideas or feelings. So now if we shift our mindsets and think storytelling. Storytelling as an art is created with imagination and skill. It's crafted. And I would suggest to you that that's vulnerable. I don't know if you've ever told a funny story or tried to, and maybe no one laughed and it was really awkward, and it probably kind of stung because you put yourself out there and it wasn't reciprocated, it wasn't received. And as Addie was saying, everything that we create, everything that we make is an extension of who we are. And so we attach the two, they're very closely connected. So storytelling is vulnerable. More than that, storytelling is beautiful. Again, the gum commercial. Why did I find such beauty in it? Actually, and what Addie said was she called art engaging. I would argue that that gum commercial engaged my emotions, engaged empathy, because it caught me in a season of life that was very similar to the situation at hand. I was a senior at the time, about to leave home and leave my parents for the first time. So I was able to reflect and really empathize with the character. And what I love about the terminology used in this definition is that beauty has this connotation of subjectivity. Right? That's something very personal to each and every one of us. What you find beautiful is different from what you might find beautiful about something, about a piece of art. And so with storytelling, I think it works a lot like that, in the sense that what reaches us is very personalized to each and every one of us. And that helps create the impact. Okay, and then lastly, storytelling as an art expresses important ideas or feelings. Now, from the perspective of Addie, who is an artist and or storyteller, she calls this introspective. She says, whatever artists choose as their subject is what they find value and beauty in. So whatever storytellers choose as their subject is what they find value and beauty in. Okay, so Nilüfer Demir, who was the Turkish photographer who took those photos of Aylan and his brother that day, I think she clearly valued the lives of refugees and probably found beauty in the hope that maybe the injustice would come to an end someday. And by looking at those photos, we get a sense, a little piece of her heart. And I would suggest that that's personalized, and this is what creates the impact for us. So storytelling as an art reaches us here as relational beings. And then that's only half of the impact. The other half that I want to talk to you today is the fact that we are meaning-seeking. So let's talk about calling. Again, we're going to define it, and this is a strong urge toward a particular way of life, or a career, or a vocation. And I thought this was kind of vague because I couldn't understand what a strong urge toward something meant. And I think the word that they were looking for was purpose. So again, we're going to change our mindsets. If storytelling is a calling, then suddenly every story has purpose. If you're sitting down with a friend over coffee and you share a story about your life, you're choosing vulnerability, you're choosing to let yourself be known. If we read a story in the newspaper about a local high schooler who made it to chess nationals, we're celebrating the little victories. Then if we turn on the news and we see something about a shooting in Las Vegas, suddenly we're hyper aware of the brokenness and depravity of man. Every story has a purpose. Okay, but what's interesting to me is that these stories that I just listed, and most stories in traditional journalism, don't actually follow a typical story pattern. And so this is where my 2 weeks as an English major may have paid off, is the graph behind me shows the typical plot line of all stories. And if you notice, everything that I talked about today has a couple of these, but I think for the most part lacks resolution. And so I was wondering, how are stories that are so prevalent in society all incomplete? And I realized that maybe they all fall here. Maybe they're not stories, maybe they're chapters and paragraphs and short stories that all are a part of a greater narrative before you. And so what I propose today is that storytelling as a whole, because this is what we see, it points to resolution. Naturally, it necessitates a bigger picture, a greater meaning to life. And as humans that are relational, storytelling meets us as an art. And as humans that desire purpose and meaning, storytelling meets us as a calling, and that's what creates that impact. So what does that mean for us? Well, I'd encourage you that as you go home for the holidays and you talk to your friends and your family and you share your life with them, you share your stories, that you could be more confident as a storyteller and as an artist, that your experiences are valuable and beautiful. Okay, and more than that, that as you share stories, whether it be a testimony of how God has shown up in your life, or maybe a disappointment that you faced recently, that you'll be able to hold both of these in light of a bigger picture, in light of the greater narrative, that what's before us isn't all that there is. And for us as Christians, we know that that is the hope that we have in Christ. So in moving forward, let us leave more confident storytellers, intentional about sharing the hope of Christ in every situation, in every interaction, and every story that we share. Thank you.